Once upon a time in the rich area of Ikoyi, Lagos, lived an old woman named Madam Felicia Wango. She was 68 years old, and she had everything money could buy. Big houses, cars, shopping plazas, landed properties, and even a mansion in Abuja. But deep inside her heart, she was a lonely woman. She had 3 grown-up children. She raised them with love and gave them everything. But now that she was old, they didn't care about her anymore. Everything changed the day she collapsed. It was a Monday morning in Ikoyi. The streets were alive with the sound of expensive cars honking, children in private school uniforms rushing into their parents' SUVs, and women in fine lace gliding into salons. Behind tall iron gates stood Madame Felicia's palatial mansion, a house so grand that neighbors whispered it was worth billions. Inside, however, the silence was deafening. Madame Felicia had just returned from her private hospital where the doctor warned her that her blood pressure was dangerously high. "You must rest," he told her firmly. "No stress, no arguments, no heavy lifting." But in that mansion, there was no one to help. Her driver had stepped outside to argue with a Danfo driver blocking the road. The housemaid had gone to buy groceries. Her 3 children, her pride, her joy, were nowhere near. She reached for the massive gold-plated gate, trying to pull it open. Her hands trembled. Her chest tightened. She breathed heavily. Then suddenly, her foot slipped on the tiled staircase. Bang! Her head hit the sharp edge of the marble step. Blood trickled down her forehead. She gasped, trying to call out for help, but her voice was weak. The world around her blurred. The last thing she remembered was the sound of her driver shouting outside, not even aware his madam was lying unconscious on the ground. When she opened her eyes again, she was not at home. She was in a cold hospital room, the steady beep of a machine echoing beside her. Her head was bandaged, her arm bruised. Slowly, she turned her head. The room was empty. Her heart sank. No Desmond. No Vanessa. No Philip. Not even one of them had come. The woman who had given them everything was lying half dead in a hospital bed, and still, they didn't show up. A nurse entered with a clipboard. "Madam Wango," she said gently, "you're very lucky to be alive. You must take things slowly now." But Madame Felicia was not listening. Her mind was on her children. The children she had raised with silk and gold. The children she had sacrificed her youth for. She whispered weakly to herself, "Where are they? Where are my children?" The nurse hesitated, looking away. The truth was simple. They knew. And they did not care. The night felt colder than usual in the private ward of St. Augustine's Specialist Hospital, one of the most expensive medical centers in Lagos. The long corridors smelled of antiseptic, and the walls gleamed under bright white lights. Patients were attended to by nurses in crisp uniforms. Wealthy men and women received visitors who came with flowers, gifts, and prayers. But Madame Felicia's room remained silent. She sat up slowly on her bed, her silk scarf tied around her wounded head. Her heart was heavy. She thought of her 3 children again, Desmond, Vanessa, and Philip. They all lived in the city. They all had cars. They all had phones. They all had excuses. Her mind drifted back to years before, when they were little. She had worked hard, not just to feed them, but to give them the very best. She sent them to private schools where school fees were higher than some people's salaries. She dressed them in imported clothes and paid for their vacations abroad. She even gave them each a brand new car on their 21st birthdays. But now, when she needed them most, they were nowhere. The nurse returned, adjusting the 4-line in her arm. "Madam, have you called your children? They should be here with you." Madame Felicia smiled sadly. "I called. They said they are busy. They will come later." But she knew the truth. Later would never come. Outside the hospital, the city was alive. Expensive nightclubs glowed with neon lights. Restaurants buzzed with laughter. In Victoria Island, young men popped bottles of champagne. Women posed for selfies with designer handbags, and loud music shook the walls of lounges. Among them was Philip, her last born, who spent the night spraying cash on dancers instead of visiting his mother. In Lekki, Vanessa attended a high-class fashion party, showing off her new Italian gown. She posted pictures on Instagram with captions like "Queen of Lagos Night Sparkles," while her mother lay in bed, lonely and weak. And Desmond? He was in a boardroom in Ikoyi, arguing with investors about money. To him, his mother's sickness was just another distraction. Meanwhile, Madame Felicia felt smaller in her massive hospital bed. The world outside was moving fast, but her own world had slowed down. She remembered the doctor's words. Your blood pressure is too high. Any stress could be dangerous. But how could she not feel stress when her own children treated her like a stranger? Tears slid down her face. She whispered, God, is this how motherhood ends? To give everything, and in return be forgotten? That night, she couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Every time she heard someone approach, her heart leapt with hope. Maybe her children had arrived. Maybe one of them would walk in. But it was always a nurse. Or a doctor. Or silence. At 2 a.m., she pressed the call button. The nurse came quickly. What is it, madam? With trembling hands, Madame Felicia said, Please, can you just sit with me for a while? I feel so alone. The young nurse, moved by her words, sat beside her bed for a few minutes. You are not alone, madam. Some children forget, but life does not forget. The way we treat those who raised us always comes back. Her words stayed with Madame Felicia long after the nurse left. She closed her eyes and wondered if her children's neglect would one day return to them in ways they never imagined. But for now, she was only a forgotten mother, rich in wealth but bankrupt in love. Morning sunlight streamed through the glass windows of St. Augustine Hospital, but it did nothing to warm Madame Felicia's heart. She lay staring at the ceiling, her thoughts circling around her children. She had given them everything, but they had turned her love into an opportunity for greed. Desmond, her firstborn, was 42 years old. He wore expensive suits tailored in Italy and drove a black Range Rover. He had a big house in Banana Island, furnished with chandeliers and imported marble. But his success was not built from hard work. It was built on his mother's wealth. When she was younger and stronger, she gave him the capital to start his business. She even signed contracts for him using her connections. Now he was one of Lagos' most visible big men. Yet to him, his mother was only a stepping stone. Whenever she called, he was always in a meeting. Whenever she asked to see him, he sent his secretary to drop excuses. Vanessa, her only daughter, was 38. She was beautiful, glamorous, and vain. Every week, she changed her wigs, her nails, and her designer clothes. She lived in a penthouse apartment in Victoria Island, where she often hosted her friends for champagne brunches. Her Instagram page was filled with photos of her posing in Dubai, Paris, and Cape Town. To her, her mother was a burden. Whenever Madame Felicia tried to call her, Vanessa would respond with one-line text messages. I'll call you later, Mum. Later never came. She loved money, gifts, and attention, but not the woman who had given her life. And then there was Philip, the last born, 32 years old. Spoiled from childhood, he never knew the meaning of hard work. He spent his days in nightclubs in Lekki, where he was known as Mr. Spray, because he loved to throw bundles of cash into the air. Most of that money came from his mother's pocket. He had sold cars she bought him. He had wasted land she gave him. To Philip, life was only about enjoyment. If he thought about his mother at all, it was only to ask for more money. Madame Felicia thought about all three of them as tears filled her eyes. She remembered Desmond's first car, the day she handed him the keys. She remembered Vanessa's graduation in London, when she paid school fees no one else could afford. She remembered Philip's first trip abroad, when he begged her for dollars to shop. She had given and given, until her own heart was empty. Now she was weak and ill, and they were not here. In the city outside, each child was living their own life of luxury. Desmond was in Ikoyi, boasting to his friends about a new property deal. Vanessa was at a spa in Lekki, pampering herself with gold facials and massages. Philip was drinking at a rooftop lounge, laughing loudly as music thundered in the background. None of them mentioned their mother. None of them cared that she had collapsed. But Lagos is a city of whispers. Already people were beginning to talk. A rich woman had fainted in her mansion. She was all alone in the hospital. Her children were nowhere to be seen. And slowly, quietly, people began to say, children who forget their mothers never escape the judgment of life. Madame Felicia did not know it yet, but the story of her children's ungratefulness was already spreading. And soon, the city would see what terrible things come to those who abandon the one who gave them everything. The sun was setting over Lagos, casting golden light on the high-rise buildings of Victoria Island. Expensive cars honked along Ozumbambadu Road, and the city was alive with the rush of evening. But inside St. Augustine Specialist Hospital, Madame Felicia lay weak, staring at the door, waiting for her children. At last they came. Desmond arrived first, stepping out of his Range Rover in a dark suit, his phone glued to his ear. He walked into the hospital lobby without greeting anyone, his polished shoes clicking on the floor. Vanessa followed soon after, in a flowing designer gown and oversized sunglasses, as if she were attending a fashion show rather than visiting her sick mother. Finally, Philip strolled in, wearing ripped jeans, sneakers, and a gold chain. His eyes were red from drinking the night before. The nurse at the reception smiled in relief. Finally, Madam's children are here. But when they reached their mother's ward,